She was just 5 years old when she lost her father in the most public way imaginable. By the time she turned 40, she'd watched nearly every person she loved disappear. Born into what seemed like American royalty, Caroline Kennedy has spent her entire life surrounded by tragedy. Some call it the Kennedy curse. Others say it's just unbearable bad luck. But for Caroline, it's simply been her life. From assassinations to plane crashes, from devastating losses to heartbreaking illness. The last surviving member of one of America's most iconic families has endured more grief than most people could imagine. This is the tragic life of Caroline Kennedy. The beginning, a childhood in the spotlight. Caroline Bouvier Kennedy entered the world on November 27, 1957, in New York City. Her father, John F. Kennedy, was a senator from Massachusetts with big ambitions. Her mother, Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy, came from a prominent family and brought elegance to everything she touched. But Caroline's birth carried weight beyond just welcoming another child. Her parents had already experienced devastating loss. Before Caroline arrived, Jackie had suffered a miscarriage. Then there was Arabella, a daughter who was stillborn in 1956. The grief from these losses hung over the young couple. When Caroline finally arrived healthy and strong, she brought joy back into their lives. For the first 3 years of her life, the family lived in Georgetown, a historic neighborhood in Washington, D.C. Her father's political career was rising fast, and the family home became a center of activity, filled with politicians, journalists, and the constant hum of ambition. Everything changed in November 1960. On the 8th of that month, when Caroline was just days away from her 3rd birthday, her father was elected President of the United States. 2 weeks later, on November 25th, Caroline got a baby brother, John F. Kennedy Jr. 2 days after that, she turned 3 years old. In the span of less than a month, Caroline went from being a senator's daughter to becoming one of the most photographed children in America. On January 20th, 1961, the Kennedy family moved into the White House. Caroline's childhood would be spent in the most famous house in the country, where her every movement was documented by photographers and her life became public property. Jackie, understanding the unique challenge of raising children under such intense scrutiny, worked hard to create something resembling a normal childhood. She set up a kindergarten in the White House solarium for Caroline and a small group of children. The goal was to give her daughter some privacy and normalcy amid the chaos. But perhaps the most famous symbol of Caroline's White House years was Macaroni, a pony given to her by Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson. Photographs of young Caroline riding Macaroni on the White House lawn became iconic images of the Kennedy presidency. The public fell in love with this little girl with her bob haircut and innocent smile. She represented hope and the future. Americans saw her as their daughter too, a symbol of youth and possibility in a new era called Camelot. Caroline's days in the White House were filled with play, lessons, and the constant presence of Secret Service agents. Her mother shielded her from much of the political pressure and media attention, but there was no escaping being the president's daughter. Even at 3 and 4 years old, Caroline was being watched, photographed, and analyzed. Every outfit she wore made headlines. Every public appearance was news. Then came the summer of 1963. In early August, Jackie gave birth to Patrick Kennedy, Caroline's second baby brother. The joy was short-lived. Patrick had been born prematurely, and despite the best medical care available, he died just 2 days after birth. Caroline was too young to fully understand what had happened, but she felt the grief that settled over her family. The White House, already a place of immense pressure, now carried the weight of fresh loss. Just 3 months later, Everything Caroline knew would be shattered forever. The day everything changed. November 22nd, 1963, started like any other day for 5-year-old Caroline Kennedy. She went to her White House kindergarten class, unaware that her father was in Dallas, Texas, or that this would be the day that defined the rest of her life. The morning was ordinary, filled with lessons and play with the other children in the White House school that Jackie had created. Caroline had no reason to think anything was different or wrong. While Caroline was at her lessons, her father's motorcade made its way through Dealey Plaza in Dallas. At 12:30 p.m. Central Time, shots rang out. President John F. Kennedy was struck by bullets. The motorcade rushed to Parkland Memorial Hospital, but the injuries were too severe. At 1 p.m., President Kennedy was pronounced dead. He was 46 years old. Back at the White House, chaos erupted among the staff and Secret Service. How do you tell a 5-year-old that her father has been killed? How do you explain assassination to a child who still believes the world is safe? These were impossible questions, with no good answers. Caroline and 3-year-old John Jr. were taken to their maternal grandmother's house in Georgetown by their nanny, Maud Shaw. Shaw, who had been with the family since Caroline was a baby, understood that the children needed to be told, but she also knew the news would shatter their world. That evening, with Caroline getting ready for bed, Shaw sat down with the little girl and gently told her that her father had gone to heaven and wouldn't be coming home. She explained that her daddy had been shot, trying to find words that a 5-year-old could understand without being too graphic. Caroline reportedly asked if her father would be coming back, if maybe he could come down from heaven to visit. Shaw had to tell her no. The conversation was heartbreaking, and it created a rift between Shaw and Jackie, who had wanted to be the one to tell her children about their father's passing. But Shaw had felt she couldn't wait, that the children needed to know before they heard it from someone else or saw it on television. The days that followed were a blur of grief and preparation. Jackie, despite her own devastating loss, took charge of planning her husband's funeral. She wanted it to be memorable, dignified, and worthy of the man he had been. She studied the funeral of Abraham Lincoln and incorporated similar elements. She wanted the American people to have the chance to say goodbye to their president, even as she was saying goodbye to her husband. What came next would be seared into the American consciousness forever. The funeral of President Kennedy was broadcast on national television, and millions of people around the world watched. The images from those days became some of the most iconic in American history. The flag-draped coffin, the riderless horse with boots reversed in the stirrups, and most heartbreakingly, the 2 small children. Caroline, dressed in a light blue coat with white trim, stood next to her mother, holding her hand tightly. She wore white gloves, and her expression was solemn, though she likely didn't fully understand the magnitude of what was happening. Her little brother, John Jr., just shy of his 3rd birthday, stood in his little coat and short pants. As the coffin passed by, John Jr. raised his hand in a salute to his father. Someone had taught him to salute, and in that moment, he did what he'd been told. The image of that tiny boy saluting his father's casket became one of the most powerful and heartbreaking moments in American history. The funeral procession moved slowly through Washington, and Caroline walked part of it, holding her mother's hand. The crowds that lined the streets wept openly, not just for their president, but for the widow and her children. Jackie's composure throughout the ordeal was remarkable, and Caroline seemed to draw strength from her mother's dignity. Caroline didn't fully comprehend what had happened. She was 5 years old. Death was an abstract concept, something that happened to other people, to grandparents maybe, but not to fathers who were young and strong and the president. But she understood that something terrible had occurred and that her mother was devastated. She understood that the White House, her home, was filled with sadness. She understood that her father wasn't coming back, even if she didn't fully grasp what that meant. Jackie, only 34 years old, was now a widow with 2 small children, and the whole world was watching her grieve. She had to be strong for her children while dealing with her own overwhelming loss. She had to plan a funeral while answering her daughter's questions about why Daddy wasn't coming home. She had to face the reality that she would raise Carolyn and John Jr. without their father, and that they would grow up knowing him only through photographs and the stories people told. 2 weeks after the assassination, in December 1963, Jackie made the painful but necessary decision to leave the White House. The new president, Lyndon Johnson, and his wife, Lady Bird, had been extraordinarily kind, telling Jackie to take as much time as she needed to move out. But Jackie knew she had to go. She moved with Caroline and John Jr. back to their old house in Georgetown, the house they'd lived in before the presidency. But the house that had once been their private home was now a tourist attraction. People stood outside at all hours, taking photographs and hoping for a glimpse of the grieving widow and her children. Tour buses would drive slowly past the house, guides pointing it out as the home where the president's family now lived. The family couldn't find peace. Caroline couldn't play outside without being photographed. The simplest trip to the store became a media event. Within a year, the situation became unbearable. Jackie made another move, this time to a penthouse apartment at 1045th Avenue on Manhattan's Upper East Side. New York City offered more anonymity than Washington, though not much. The city was big enough that maybe, just maybe, they could blend in a little more. Maybe Caroline could have something resembling a normal childhood. Jackie enrolled Caroline at the Convent of the Sacred Heart, a private Catholic school in Manhattan. The school was prestigious, but also protective of its students' privacy. Caroline could attend classes without constant media intrusion, though everyone at the school knew exactly who she was. She tried desperately to give her children as normal a life as possible, but normal was never really an option. Caroline grew up with Secret Service protection following her everywhere. Photographers still tried to get pictures of her. Other children treated her differently, either in awe of her famous name or uncomfortable around her because they didn't know how to talk about her dead father. As Caroline entered her school years, she was described by historians and biographers as shy and somewhat removed from her peers. She carried the weight of being a Kennedy, of being the daughter of Camelot, of being the little girl everyone had watched at her father's funeral. People expected things from her simply because of her last name. They watched her grow up, comparing her to the little girl they remembered from the White House, looking for signs of her father in her face and mannerisms. The innocence of her early childhood was gone, replaced by a quiet understanding that her life would never be like other children's lives. She couldn't just be Caroline. She had to be Caroline Kennedy, daughter of the slain president, symbol of a nation's grief, keeper of a legacy she hadn't asked for. But the tragedy wasn't finished with the Kennedy family. Caroline had already lost her father and her baby brother Patrick. But more loss was coming, and it would reshape her childhood yet again, Uncle Bobby and the widening circle of grief. For Caroline and John Jr., their Uncle Bobby became a lifeline after their father's death. Robert F. Kennedy, the former Attorney General and New York Senator, stepped into a fatherly role for his brother's children. He spent time with them, took them on outings, and tried to fill the impossible gap left by their father. Caroline and her brother grew incredibly close to him. By 1968, Uncle Bobby had decided to run for president. He was winning primaries and building momentum. The country, still wounded from JFK's assassination, was beginning to believe in hope again. Caroline, now 10 years old, watched her uncle campaign and understood that he might become president, just like her father had been. On June 5th, 1968, Robert Kennedy won the California primary. It was a major victory that put him on a clear path to the Democratic nomination. That night, he gave a victory speech at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. After the speech, as he walked through the hotel kitchen, shots were fired. Robert Kennedy was struck multiple times. He died the next day, June 6, 1968. Caroline was 10 years old when she lost her second father figure. In less than 5 years, she'd watched two of the men she loved most taken by violence. The assassination of Robert Kennedy devastated Jackie, who now feared deeply for her children's safety. She famously said after Bobby's death that if they were killing Kennedys, then her children were targets too. The weight of this grief and fear drove Jackie to make a controversial decision. Just 4 months after Robert Kennedy's death, in October 1968, Jackie married Greek shipping magnate Aristotle Onassis. The marriage shocked the American public, who felt almost possessive of the widowed First Lady. But for Jackie, it was about protection and security. Onassis was one of the wealthiest men in the world, and he could provide a level of safety that she desperately wanted for Caroline and John Jr. The marriage brought significant changes to Caroline's life. Suddenly, she had a stepfather, though Aristotle Onassis was very different from the father she remembered. Onassis showered Caroline and John Jr. with extravagant gifts and took them on his yacht around the Greek islands. But Caroline struggled to accept him. The relationship was complicated, and there were tensions between Onassis's own children and Jackie's. During this period, Caroline turned increasingly to her Uncle Ted Kennedy for comfort and support. Edward Kennedy, the youngest of the Kennedy brothers, and now the only surviving son of Joseph and Rose Kennedy, became another important figure in Caroline's life. She grew very close to him, finding in Ted someone who understood the unique burden of being a Kennedy. The family split their time between New York and Greece. When they were in New York, Onassis provided security for them. During vacations and breaks, they sailed around the Caribbean or spent time in Greece. Caroline attended school in New York, but lived a life split between two very different worlds. In 1975, when Caroline was 17, Aristotle Onassis died. Caroline returned to Greece for his funeral, another loss in a life that seemed defined by them. Just a few days later, she, her mother, and John Jr. attended a ceremony in Paris where Jackie's sister, Eunice Kennedy Shriver, received France's Legion of Honor Award. Later that same year, something happened that brought Caroline even closer to tragedy. She was in London, taking a year-long art course at Sotheby's auction house. She was staying with Conservative Member of Parliament Sir Hugh Fraser and his wife Antonia. Every morning, they would drive together to Sotheby's. On this particular morning, an IRA car bomb had been planted under the Frasers' car. But Caroline hadn't left the house yet. The bomb exploded while a neighbour, an oncologist named Professor Gordon Hamilton Fairley, was walking his dog past the car. He was killed instantly. If Caroline had been just a few minutes earlier in her routine, she would have been in that car. The close call with death was yet another reminder that tragedy seemed to follow the Kennedy name, building a life. Despite the shadows. Despite everything, Caroline worked hard to build a life of her own. She attended Radcliffe College, where she pursued a degree in history. She was an excellent student, focused and dedicated to her education. Her mother had always emphasized the importance of learning and intellectual growth, and Caroline embraced that fully. She graduated from Radcliffe in 1980, and her family was there to celebrate, including her brother John Jr., her mother Jackie, and Uncle Ted. But even graduation day couldn't be truly private. Photographers documented the event, and Caroline's accomplishments were always viewed through the lens of being a Kennedy. She couldn't just be a college graduate. She was President Kennedy's daughter graduating from college. After college, Caroline went on to attend Columbia Law School, earning her law degree in 1988. She worked at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City, where she met Edwin Schlossberg, an exhibit designer and interactive media artist. Ed was accomplished in his own right, creating interactive experiences and art installations. He was 13 years older than Caroline, intellectual, and understood the complexity of Caroline's life. They fell in love, and on July 19, 1986, Caroline and Ed were married at Our Lady of Victory Church in Centerville, Massachusetts, on Cape Cod. Her cousin, Maria Shriver, served as matron of honor, and Uncle Ted walked her down the aisle. Caroline chose not to change her surname when she married. She would remain Caroline Kennedy. The wedding was beautiful, but like everything in Caroline's life, intensely scrutinized by the media. Photographers tried to get images of the ceremony. News outlets covered every detail. Caroline and Ed tried to maintain their privacy, but it was a constant battle. Over the next several years, Caroline and Ed had 3 children. Their first daughter, Rose Kennedy Schlossberg, was born in 1988. Their second daughter, Tatiana Celia Kennedy Schlossberg, arrived in 1990. And in 1993, they welcomed their son, John Bouvier Kennedy Schlossberg, known as Jack. Finally, Caroline had created her own family, separate from the public tragedy of her childhood. Caroline and Ed raised their children in Manhattan, but somewhat separated from the large Kennedy clan in Hyannisport. She wanted to give her children something closer to normalcy than she'd had. She remained close with her brother John Jr., and the two talked frequently, supporting each other through the unique challenges of being Kennedy children. In 1994, tragedy struck again. Jackie Kennedy Onassis, who had been diagnosed with non-Hodgkin lymphoma, passed away at her Fifth Avenue apartment. She was only 64 years old. Caroline, now 36, and John Jr., 33, were with their mother when she died. The woman who had tried so hard to protect them, who had guided them through unimaginable grief and public scrutiny, was gone. Caroline's mother had been her anchor, her protector, and her guide. Losing Jackie meant losing the one person who truly understood what it was like to be thrust into history's spotlight at such a young age. The grief was profound. Caroline and John Jr. leaned on each other more than ever, the 2 surviving children of Camelot, trying to navigate a world that seemed determined to take everyone they loved. But they still had each other, and for Caroline, that meant everything. The night that shattered everything. Caroline's relationship with her younger brother John had always been special. They had shared experiences that no one else could truly understand. They'd grown up in the White House together, lost their father together, navigated their mother's remarriage together, and supported each other through Jackie's death. John Jr. had become a magazine publisher, founding George, a political magazine. He had married Carolyn Bessette in 1996, a publicist for Calvin Klein, in a private ceremony that nonetheless became major news. Caroline had concerns about John's newest hobby, flying. He'd gotten his pilot's license in April 1998 and had bought himself a Piper Saratoga airplane. Caroline hoped his interest in flying would be temporary. When their cousin Michael Kennedy died in a skiing accident in late 1997, John had taken a break from flying lessons, and Caroline hoped he'd give it up entirely. But he resumed his lessons, and Caroline didn't push too hard to stop him. On the evening of Friday, July 16th, 1999, John was planning to fly from New Jersey to Massachusetts for their cousin Rory Kennedy's wedding. With him would be his wife Carolyn and her sister Lauren Bissett. The plan was to drop Lauren off at Martha's Vineyard, then continue to Hyannisport for the wedding the next day. John took off from Essex County Airport in New Jersey at 8:38 p.m. The weather conditions weren't ideal. Haze reduced visibility, and darkness was falling. John had his pilot's license, but was only certified for visual flight rules, meaning he needed to be able to see landmarks to navigate. He didn't have the instrument rating necessary to fly safely in poor visibility conditions. Somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean, John lost control of the plane. Investigators would later determine that he experienced spatial disorientation in the haze and darkness, unable to distinguish the horizon from the water. The plane began to descend. John, Carolyn, and Lauren were all killed on impact when the plane crashed into the ocean. When the plane didn't arrive at Martha's Vineyard, alarm bells went off. A massive search operation began. For days, the Coast Guard and Navy searched the waters off Martha's Vineyard. The whole country waited for news. Caroline waited, knowing in her heart what the outcome would be, but hoping desperately for a miracle. On July 19th, fragments of the plane were located using sonar. The next day, Navy divers found the wreckage on the ocean floor, about 120 feet below the surface. They recovered 3 bodies. John's body was still strapped into the pilot's seat. Carolyn and Lauren were found near the fuselage, still strapped into their seats as well. The autopsies confirmed they had died on impact. Caroline, at 41 years old, was now the sole survivor of her immediate family. Her father, assassinated when she was 5. Her baby brother Patrick, who lived only 2 days. Her mother, taken by cancer at 64. And now John Jr., dead in a plane crash at 38. Caroline had no siblings left, no parents, no one who shared her specific history, her specific grief, her specific understanding of what it meant to be a Kennedy child. The ashes of John Jr., Carolyn, and Lauren were scattered at sea on July 22, 1999, from the Navy destroyer USS Briscoe. Caroline insisted on privacy, rejecting Uncle Ted's preference for a public service. She wanted this grief to be hers, not the nation's. A memorial service was held the next day at the Church of St. Thomas More in New York City. The parish John Jr. had often attended with his mother and sister. President Bill Clinton was there, along with hundreds of mourners. In his will, John Jr. left everything to Caroline's 3 children, Rose, Tatiana, and Jack. His estate, estimated between $30 and $100 million, was divided among his nieces and nephew. It was as if John Jr. knew that Caroline and her children were the future of the Kennedy line, and he wanted to make sure they were taken care of. The loss of John Jr. changed Caroline fundamentally. She became even more private, even more protective of her family. She rarely gave interviews and avoided the spotlight whenever possible. She had spent her entire life watching people she loved die, and she was determined to protect what remained. A life of purpose, despite the pain. In the years after John Jr.'s death, Caroline channeled her grief into honoring her family's legacy. In 1989, even before John Jr.'s death, she had helped create the Profile in Courage Award, named after her father's Pulitzer Prize-winning book. The award honors acts of political courage and is presented annually. She became deeply involved with the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum, serving as honorary president of its foundation. Caroline also became an author, writing several books that reflected her interests and her family's values. She wrote about the Bill of Rights, constitutional law, and her mother's love of poetry. Her book, The Best Loved Poems of Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, was a tribute to Jackie's literary sensibilities and became a bestseller. Through her writing, Caroline could control her own narrative in a way she'd never been able to as a child. In 2013, Caroline stepped into public service in a major way when President Barack Obama nominated her to serve as United States Ambassador to Japan. It was a significant appointment, and Caroline took it seriously. She served with distinction from 2013 to 2017, working to strengthen the relationship between the United States and Japan. During her tenure in Tokyo, her son Jack lived with her, gaining valuable international experience. After her time as ambassador to Japan, Caroline returned to private life, but not for long. In 2022, she was appointed as United States Ambassador to Australia, serving until 2024. She threw herself into diplomatic work, continuing the Kennedy tradition of public service while maintaining her fierce protection of her family's privacy. Through all of this, Caroline worked to give her own children a different experience than she'd had. Rose, Tatiana, and Jack grew up with more privacy than Caroline ever enjoyed. They pursued their own interests and careers. Rose worked in film and television. Tatiana became an environmental journalist and author, writing about climate change and publishing the book Inconspicuous Consumption in 2019. Jack, bearing a striking resemblance to his late uncle John Jr., became a political writer and founded a non-profit organization focused on energy efficiency. Caroline had succeeded in giving her children something she never had: the ability to define themselves outside of tragedy. They were Kennedys, yes, but they were their own people too, or so it seemed. The curse returns. A mother's worst nightmare. On November 22nd, 2024, exactly 61 years after her grandfather's assassination, Tatiana Schlossberg published an essay in The New Yorker titled "A Battle with My Blood." The date wasn't coincidental. In the essay, Tatiana revealed that in May 2024, shortly after giving birth to her second child, she had been diagnosed with acute myeloid leukemia, a rare and aggressive form of cancer. The diagnosis came as a shock. Tatiana was only 34 years old, a mother of 2 small children, married to her husband George Moran, whom she'd met at Yale. She was young, healthy, and full of life. But the cancer was terminal. Despite undergoing chemotherapy, bone marrow transplants, and a clinical trial for immunotherapy, the cancer kept returning. Doctors gave her a prognosis of 1 year to live. In her heartbreaking essay, Tatiana wrote about how she'd spent her whole life trying to protect her mother from more pain. She described herself as someone who tried to be a good student, a good sister, a good daughter. She wrote that she'd always tried to never make her mother upset or angry. And now, she had added a new tragedy to Caroline's life, to the family's life, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. For Caroline, the diagnosis must have felt like history repeating itself. Her whole life had been marked by loss. Her father, her baby brother Patrick, Uncle Bobby, her mother, her brother John Jr., and now her daughter. The Kennedy curse, that dark shadow that had followed her family for generations, was claiming another victim. Tatiana fought hard. She endured brutal treatments, including chemotherapy that made her violently ill and bone marrow transplants that required her to be isolated. She participated in clinical trials, hoping that experimental treatments might work where traditional ones had failed. Through it all, she tried to spend as much time as possible with her 2 young children and her husband. She wrote in her essay about trying to live in the present, about watching her children grow up while simultaneously remembering her own childhood. She wrote about the strange sensation of trying to remember moments that she knew she wouldn't be alive to recall. She wrote about what death might be like and how there was no one to tell her what comes after. On December 30th, 2025, Tatiana Schlossberg died. She was 35 years old. The announcement came from the JFK Library Foundation's Instagram account, with a message from her family stating that their beautiful Tatiana had passed away that morning and would always be in their hearts. Caroline Kennedy, at 68 years old, was now burying her child. She had experienced almost every form of loss imaginable, but this was different. No parent should have to bury their child, and for Caroline, it was one more name added to a list that had been growing her entire life. Tatiana left behind her husband, George, and their two small children. She left behind her older sister, Rose, and younger brother, Jack. And she left behind Caroline, who once again found herself at the center of unimaginable grief, the weight of survival. Today, Caroline Kennedy continues to serve as ambassador to Australia, though she announced in 2024 that she planned to leave the position regardless of who won the presidential election. At 68, she carries the weight of being the last surviving member of her immediate family. She's watched her entire family disappear, one by one, over the course of her life. Some people talk about the Kennedy curse as if it's a supernatural force. But for Caroline, it's just been her reality. Assassination, plane crashes, cancer, bombs. The methods change, but the result is always the same: loss. Recently, Caroline has been in the news for speaking out against her cousin, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who was nominated for Secretary of Health and Human Services. Caroline wrote a letter to senators urging them not to confirm him, calling him a predator, and describing disturbing behavior from their childhood. She accused him of exploiting their father's assassinations for political gain. The public feud highlighted how fractured the Kennedy family has become, torn apart by politics, tragedy, and time. But through it all, Caroline has maintained her dignity. She's rarely given interviews about her personal life. She doesn't exploit her family's tragedy for attention or sympathy. She works quietly to honor their legacy through public service, through her work with the Kennedy Library, and through raising her own children to understand the weight of their name while also being free to define themselves. Caroline still has her two surviving children, Rose and Jack. She has her husband, Ed, who has been by her side for nearly 40 years. She has her work, her mission to serve the public good, and her determination to keep her family's legacy alive. But she also carries scars that will never heal. She's the little girl who held her mother's hand at her father's funeral. She's the teenager who lost Uncle Bobby. She's the sister who scattered her brother's ashes at sea. She's the daughter who watched her mother die too young. And now, she's the mother who has buried her own child. Caroline Kennedy is a survivor, but survival comes with a price. She's spent 68 years watching the people she loves disappear. She's spent a lifetime being strong when she probably wanted to fall apart. She's lived in the shadow of tragedy while trying to build a life of meaning and purpose. The Kennedy curse, if it exists, has taken almost everything from Caroline. But it hasn't taken her strength, her grace, or her determination to honor those she's lost by living a life of service and dignity. That may be the only victory possible in a story defined by so much loss. Caroline Kennedy's life is a testament to the human capacity for endurance. Born into privilege and promise, she instead inherited a legacy of grief. The tragedies that have marked her life would have broken many people. The assassination of her father when she was just 5 years old. The murder of Uncle Bobby 3 years later. The death of her mother from cancer. The plane crash that took her beloved brother John Jr., and most recently, the loss of her daughter Tatiana to leukemia at just 35 years old. Each loss has been public, scrutinized by a nation that feels almost ownership over the Kennedy family. Caroline has never been allowed to grieve privately. Her pain has always been observed, photographed, analyzed, and yet she has persevered, building a life of public service, raising a family, and honoring the legacy of those she's lost. The Kennedy curse, whether real or simply a way to make sense of improbable tragedy, has haunted Caroline since childhood. She is the sole survivor of her immediate family, the last living connection to Camelot, to those brief 1,000 days when her father was president and everything seemed possible. But Caroline has proven that she is more than just a survivor. She's an author, a diplomat, a mother, and a guardian of her family's legacy. She's carried the weight of being a Kennedy with remarkable grace, even as that weight has crushed so much of what she's loved. As Caroline continues her life's work, she does so knowing that she carries not just her own memories, but the memories of everyone who's been taken. She is the keeper of the stories, the protector of the legacy, and the living embodiment of resilience in the face of unimaginable loss. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories. She slept with artists, collected their work, and transformed modern art in America. Peggy Guggenheim had wealth, fame, and influence that most people only dream about. She moved through the 20th century like someone who couldn't be touched by normal rules. But behind the glamorous facade, behind the shocking behavior and the groundbreaking art collection, was a woman who never stopped running from herself. A woman whose daughter would pay the ultimate price for a mother's inability to love. This is the story of how one of art's greatest patrons destroyed everything she touched, including the people closest to her. The daughter of disaster. Marguerite Guggenheim, called Peggy from childhood, was born on August 26, 1898, into one of America's wealthiest Jewish families. The Guggenheims had made their fortune in mining and smelting, building an empire that rivaled the Rockefellers and Vanderbilts. Peggy's father, Benjamin Guggenheim, was one of 7 sons of mining magnate Meyer Guggenheim. Her mother, Florette Seligman, came from another prominent Jewish banking family. But Peggy never felt like she truly belonged to this world of privilege. She was the middle daughter, sandwiched between her older sister Benita and younger sister Barbara. In the rigid social hierarchy of New York's German Jewish elite, the Guggenheims occupied an uncomfortable position. They had the money, but not quite the social acceptance. They were wealthy, but newly wealthy. And Peggy, with her unconventional looks and awkward manner, felt like an outsider in her own family. Her childhood was marked by distance. Her parents' marriage was troubled from the start. Benjamin was frequently away on business trips to Europe, maintaining an apartment in Paris that everyone knew served purposes beyond business. Florette became increasingly withdrawn, focusing her attention on maintaining social appearances rather than connecting with her daughters. The children were raised primarily by governesses and servants in the family's mansion on the Upper East Side. Then came April 15th, 1912. Peggy was 13 years old when her father boarded the RMS Titanic for his return journey from Europe. He wasn't traveling alone. Benjamin had brought his mistress, Léontine Aubard, a French singer, along with his valet, Victor Guillot, Léontine's maid, Emma Segessa, and his chauffeur, René Pernot. The arrangements were made in first class, with Benjamin and Giglio sharing cabin B-84. When the Titanic struck the iceberg, late on the night of April 14th, Benjamin and Giglio initially slept through the collision. They were awakened by Léontine and Emma, who had felt the impact. Bedroom steward Henry Etches arrived at their cabin and helped Benjamin into a lifebelt, despite his protests that it hurt. Etches made him put on a heavy sweater and sent him up to the boat deck. What happened next became the stuff of legend. As the situation grew more desperate and it became clear the ship would sink, Benjamin made a decision. He returned to his cabin with Giglio, and both men changed into their finest evening wear, white ties and tails. When Etches encountered them again and asked why they'd changed, Benjamin told him they were prepared to go down like gentlemen. He sent a message intended for his wife. "If anything should happen to me, tell my wife in New York that I've done my best in doing my duty." Leontine and her maid secured places in Lifeboat 9 and survived. Benjamin, Giglio, and chauffeur Perno all perished when the Titanic sank. Survivors reported seeing Benjamin and Giglio seated in deck chairs on the grand staircase, sipping brandy and smoking cigars as the ship went down. The news reached New York on April 18th, confirmed by wireless dispatch from the Carpathia. For 13-year-old Peggy, her father's death was transformative, but not in the way most people might expect. Benjamin had not been a devoted father. His frequent absences, his open affair with Leontine, his distance from his daughters, all of this had created a void in Peggy's life long before the Titanic sank. His death simply made that absence permanent and gave it a tragic, romantic quality it hadn't possessed in life. Years later, Peggy would describe the Titanic disaster with a strange detachment, as if it had happened to someone else's father. She inherited $2.5 million from Benjamin's estate, far less than her wealthier cousins received from their fathers. The money came in a trust fund that provided her with about $22,000 a year, enough to live comfortably, but not extravagantly by Guggenheim standards. But something else happened after Benjamin's death. Florette, always emotionally distant, became even more withdrawn. She focused obsessively on maintaining respectability, on doing what society expected, on ensuring her daughters married well and preserved the family name. For Peggy, who felt ugly, unwanted, and inadequate, her mother's emotional coldness became unbearable. The pattern was set early. Peggy would spend her entire life seeking validation, love, and acceptance from men who couldn't or wouldn't provide it. She would collect people the way she later collected art, compulsively, desperately, always hoping the next acquisition would finally fill the emptiness inside. But first, she had to escape. And escape meant Europe, the Bohemian years, and the first marriage. In 1920, Peggy graduated from the Jacobi School in New York. She was 21 years old, had access to her inheritance, and wanted desperately to get away from her mother's stifling influence. She took a job at the Sunwise Turn bookstore in Manhattan, a gathering place for writers and artists. It was her first exposure to Bohemian culture, and she found it intoxicating. The following year, she sailed for Europe with her cousin Harold Loeb, a writer and publisher. Paris in the 1920s was the center of the avant-garde, full of American expatriates and European artists creating new forms of expression. Peggy threw herself into this world with the abandon of someone who'd been caged her entire life. She met Constantin Brancusi, Marcel Duchamp, Man Ray, and dozens of other artists and writers who would shape 20th century culture. She became friends with Juna Barnes, a novelist and poet who would remain one of her closest confidants for decades. She frequented cafes and salons, attended wild parties, and for the first time in her life, felt like she belonged somewhere. In 1922, she met Lawrence Vail, a writer and Dada sculptor known as the King of Bohemia. Lawrence embodied everything Peggy's mother would have hated. He was handsome, talented, charismatic, and utterly unreliable. He drank heavily, had violent mood swings, and treated social conventions with contempt. Peggy fell completely in love. They married that year, and Peggy believed she'd finally escaped her bourgeois upbringing. They lived in Paris, then moved to the south of France, embracing a lifestyle of artistic freedom and deliberate provocation. Peggy wanted to shock, to prove she wasn't just another wealthy New York heiress. She cut her hair short, wore outrageous clothes, and adopted bohemian manners that would have horrified her mother. In 1923, she gave birth to their son, Michael Cedric Sinbad Vale. 2 years later, their daughter Peggy Jezebel Margaret Vale was born. But motherhood didn't come naturally to Peggy. She later admitted in her autobiography that she was inadequate as a mother, that she didn't know how to show affection, that she found the demands of children exhausting and boring. Meanwhile, the marriage was disintegrating. Lawrence's drinking grew worse. His moods became more violent. He would fly into rages, sometimes physical, often directed at Peggy. She described incidents in her memoir where he publicly humiliated her, threw her belongings out of windows, and treated her with savage cruelty. But Peggy didn't leave, not immediately. She seemed to believe that suffering was the price of living an authentic, artistic life. She endured Lawrence's behavior for years, convincing herself that this was what marriage to a true artist looked like. The violence, the drinking, the infidelity, these were just the costs of escaping her mother's world. In 1928, Lawrence began an affair with Kay Boyle, a writer Peggy had considered a friend. The betrayal was complete. Peggy and Lawrence divorced around 1928, with Lawrence eventually marrying Kay. Peggy was left with 2 young children and a growing sense that love was something other people experienced, not her. After the divorce, Peggy continued living in Europe. She had affairs with various men, including John Holmes, a British writer she described as the love of her life. Holmes was married, but separated. A war veteran who suffered from writer's block and drank excessively. Peggy supported him financially and emotionally, hoping he would eventually divorce his wife and marry her. He never did. In 1934, Holmes died following surgery for a broken wrist that became infected. Peggy was devastated. She later described his death as the end of her emotional life, though she would have dozens of affairs in the decades that followed. After Holmes, she lived with Douglas Garman, a British writer and communist activist, for several years. But that relationship, too, eventually ended. The pattern was clear. Peggy was attracted to men who were creative, damaged, and ultimately unavailable. She threw herself at them with complete abandon, offering money, support, and devotion. And inevitably, they disappointed her. She would spend the rest of her life repeating this pattern, each time hoping for a different outcome. But something was changing in Peggy. The affairs were no longer enough. She needed a purpose beyond collecting lovers. She needed something that was hers, something she could control, something that would give her life meaning. She needed art, the birth of the collector. Peggy's transformation from dilettante to serious art collector began in the late 1930s. She'd always been around art, had always known artists, but she'd never thought of herself as someone who could shape the art world. That changed when she met Peggy Waldman in Paris. Waldman ran a small gallery and suggested that Peggy open her own. The idea appealed to Peggy's need for purpose and her desire to be taken seriously. In January 1938, at age 39, she opened Guggenheim Jeune Gallery in London. The name was a play on the well-established Bernheim Jeune Gallery in Paris, adding a Guggenheim twist. Marcel Duchamp became her advisor and guide. Duchamp had a genius for understanding modern art and an equally sharp eye for recognizing Peggy's vulnerabilities. He taught her what to look for, which artists mattered, and how to navigate the art world. Under his tutelage, Peggy began exhibiting work by Wassily Kandinsky, Yves Tanguy, and other modernist masters. The gallery exhibited work by both established and emerging artists. Peggy held a show of children's drawings, including work by her 12-year-old daughter Peggy, who was already showing artistic talent. It was one of the few times Peggy actively promoted her daughter's gifts. But the gallery faced financial difficulties almost immediately. Peggy lacked business acumen, and the looming threat of war made selling art increasingly difficult. In 1939, she closed Guggenheim Jeune, but instead of giving up, she pivoted. If she couldn't run a successful commercial gallery, she would create a museum of modern art in London. She began acquiring pieces at an astonishing rate. Working with a list provided by art historian Herbert Read, she decided to buy one picture a day. With war approaching and the art market in chaos, prices were collapsing. Peggy took advantage of the instability, acquiring masterpieces for a fraction of their normal value. Some criticized her for profiting from Europe's crisis. She saw it as preservation, saving art from the coming destruction. In December 1939, she had a brief but intense affair with Samuel Beckett, the Irish writer who would later win the Nobel Prize for Literature. Beckett encouraged her to focus exclusively on modern art, rather than trying to span centuries. His advice shaped the collection that would eventually make her famous. By 1940, Germany had invaded France, and Paris was no longer safe. Peggy faced a decision. She could flee immediately, or she could try to save as much art as possible. She chose the art. She raced around Paris, buying pieces from artists and galleries desperate to sell before the Nazis arrived. She acquired works by Pablo Picasso, Georges Braque, Salvador Dali, and dozens of others. The logistics of evacuation were nightmarish. How do you transport hundreds of paintings across a continent at war? Peggy came up with a solution that was either brilliant or insane. She shipped her collection to the Louvre, which had underground storage for protecting France's national treasures. She told them the collection belonged to a museum she was establishing. When the Louvre curator examined the modern works, the abstract paintings and surrealist pieces that looked nothing like traditional art, he refused to accept them. "They're not art," he told her. "They weren't worth protecting." Peggy had to find another solution. She had the paintings rolled up and shipped as household goods, claiming they were personal belongings. In June 1941, she finally escaped France, bringing her children, her collection, and her new husband with her. The husband was Max Ernst, the German surrealist painter she'd fallen in love with while helping him escape the Nazis. Ernst was married to someone else when they met, but that hadn't stopped either of them. They married in 1941 after Ernst's divorce came through. Peggy arrived in New York as war engulfed Europe. She'd saved her art collection. She'd married a famous artist. She was ready to conquer the American art world. What she didn't realize was that she was bringing her own destruction with her. Art of this century and the rise to fame. In October 1942, Peggy Guggenheim opened Art of This Century Gallery at 30 West 57th Street in Manhattan. The gallery was unlike anything New York had seen before. Austrian architect Friedrich Kiesler designed the space with curved walls, paintings suspended from wires, and special lighting that made the entire experience feel like walking through a dream. The gallery had 4 distinct sections. 3 galleries were dedicated to cubist and abstract art, surrealism, and kinetic art. The 4th, the front room, operated as a commercial space where Peggy could sell works and support living artists. This combination of museum and gallery was revolutionary. Peggy wasn't just displaying art. She was creating a complete aesthetic experience. Art of This Century quickly became the center of New York's avant-garde scene. European artists who'd fled the war mingled with young American painters trying to find their voice. Peggy held groundbreaking exhibitions, including the 1943 Exhibition by 31 Women, the first documented all-women art exhibition in the United States. The show featured Frida Kahlo, Marette Oppenheim, Leonora Carrington, Louise Nevelson, and her own daughter, Peggy, then just 18 years old. But Peggy's real genius wasn't just in exhibiting famous artists, it was in discovering unknown ones. In 1943, she organized a show called Spring Salon for Young Artists. One of the submissions came from an alcoholic house painter in his early 30s named Jackson Pollock. Pollock's work was raw, violent, and unlike anything else being produced in America. Most galleries would have rejected it immediately. Peggy was fascinated. She gave him a contract guaranteeing $150 per month, and in return, she got first pick of everything he produced. She commissioned Pollock to create a mural for her apartment entrance hall, the largest painting he'd ever attempted, measuring 8 feet high and nearly 20 feet long. The commission terrified Pollock. He stared at the blank canvas for weeks, drinking heavily, unable to start. Then, the night before the deadline, he painted the entire thing in one explosive session. The result was a masterpiece, a preview of the abstract expressionism that would make Pollock famous. Peggy promoted Pollock relentlessly. She organized exhibitions, convinced critics to review his work, and used her connections to get him noticed by museums. She essentially created the Jackson Pollock phenomenon, transforming an unknown alcoholic into one of the most important American artists of the 20th century. But her relationship with Pollock was complicated. She slept with many of the artists she promoted, and some biographers suggest Pollock was among them, though the evidence is ambiguous. What's clear is that Peggy's support came with strings. She wanted gratitude, loyalty, and recognition that she'd made these artists' careers possible. Meanwhile, her marriage to Max Ernst was falling apart. Ernst resented Peggy's controlling nature and her financial hold over him. He began an affair with Dorothea Tanning, a younger, surrealist painter. Peggy retaliated by having affairs of her own, sometimes with men she barely knew. The marriage became a war of mutual humiliation. In 1946, Peggy and Max divorced. Ernst married Tanning and moved to Arizona, where he would spend the rest of his life. Peggy was left in New York, running her gallery, supporting dozens of artists, and slowly realizing that America wasn't where she wanted to be. Her relationship with her children was virtually non-existent. Sindbad, her son, had his own life and kept his distance. Peggy, her daughter, was now in her early 20s and struggling. She'd married Jean Hélion, a French painter, in 1946, but the relationship was troubled from the start. Peggy had promoted Peggy's art, displayed her work in exhibitions, and introduced her to important artists, but she'd never learned how to simply be a mother. Peggy later told friends that her mother was incapable of giving affection. When Peggy tried to get close, Peggy would push her away with cutting remarks or sudden coldness. Peggy treated her daughter the way her own mother had treated her, with emotional distance disguised as sophisticated detachment. In 1947, Peggy made a decision. She was leaving America and returning to Europe. She'd conquered New York, established herself as a major figure in the art world, and proven that she was more than just a wealthy dilettante. But she was also lonely, increasingly isolated, and aware that the art world was moving beyond her. Younger collectors with more money were entering the scene. Abstract expressionism, which she'd helped launch, was becoming mainstream. She closed Art of This Century, disappointing the artists who depended on her support. She had her collection shipped to Europe, and in 1948, She exhibited it at the Greek pavilion of the Venice Biennale. The show was a sensation. Europeans, starved for modern art after years of war, discovered American artists like Pollock for the first time. Peggy's collection became the most coherent survey of modernism yet shown in Italy. She fell in love with Venice immediately, the city's beauty, its decay, its romance. Everything about it appealed to her. In 1949, she purchased the Palazzo Venier dei Leoni on the Grand Canal. The palace was unfinished, an 18th century building that had never been completed. It was strange, unique, and perfect for Peggy. She would spend the next 30 years there, turning the palazzo into a museum and herself into a Venetian legend. But she brought all her demons with her, and those demons were about to destroy what remained of her family. The Venice years and the price of fame. Peggy's early years in Venice had a dreamlike quality. She lived in one of the most beautiful cities in the world, surrounded by her art collection, and had become an international celebrity. Tourists came to see the palazzo. Art critics wrote about her collection. She hosted parties attended by writers, artists, and musicians from around the world. She opened her home to the public several afternoons a week during spring, summer, and early autumn. Visitors wandered through her living spaces, examining masterpieces hanging on the walls, while Peggy's beloved dogs roamed freely. She installed modern sculptures in her garden, creating a unique outdoor gallery space. Her personal life continued its chaotic pattern. She had affairs with younger men, mostly Italian, most of whom were interested in her money and connections more than in her. She seemed aware of this, but didn't care. The companionship, however shallow, was better than being alone. Truman Capote visited her multiple times throughout the 1950s, staying at the palazzo for weeks at a time. He used Peggy as a character in some of his writing, thinly veiled portraits that captured both her generosity and her neediness. Other writers and artists came through: John Cage, Yves Tanguy, countless others. Peggy held court in Venice like an empress of modern art. But behind the glamorous facade, family tragedy was building. Her daughter Pegine was suffering. Pegine had divorced Jean Hélion in the mid-1950s after having 3 sons with him. She was painting prolifically, creating works that combined surrealism with naive art. Colourful, dreamlike scenes, featuring doll-like figures that seemed happy but had empty, haunted eyes. Critics who understood Pegine's work recognized what she was expressing. The cheerful families and affectionate couples in her paintings represented what she'd never had: a stable, loving home. The painting's surface charm couldn't hide the loneliness underneath. In 1957, Pegine attended a Francis Bacon exhibition at the Hanover Gallery in London. There she met Ralph Rumney, an English painter and one of the founders of the Situationist international art movement. Ralph was everything Pegine shouldn't have fallen for: unstable, financially dependent, and emotionally manipulative. But he was also charming, artistically interesting, and paid attention to her in a way her mother never had. They married in 1958. Pegine gave birth to their son, Sandro Rumney, the same year. For a brief time, Pegine seemed happier. She lived first on the Ile Saint-Louis in Paris, then moved back to Venice, setting up a studio in the basement of her mother's palazzo. But Peggy despised Ralph. She saw him as a fortune hunter, someone using Pegine to access the Guggenheim money and connections. Her hostility toward him was open and constant. When Pegine and Ralph visited the palazzo, Peggy would make cutting remarks, question Ralph's artistic abilities, and find ways to humiliate him in front of others. Peggy's grandson, Sandro, later described his grandmother as someone who had a knack for making his mother cry. He said Peggy was incapable of having human relationships or giving affection. These statements came from someone who, as a child, had watched his grandmother systematically undermine his mother's fragile mental health. Peggy struggled with depression her entire adult life. She'd attempted to take her own life multiple times, and Ralph had intervened to save her. But living with her mother nearby, dealing with Peggy's constant criticism and emotional coldness, was destroying what little stability Peggy had managed to build. In the early 1960s, Peggy created glass sculptures with artist Egidio Costantini, achieving some artistic success. In 1966, she held exhibitions in Canada, Stockholm, and Philadelphia. Her work was being recognized internationally. For someone who'd grown up in the shadow of her famous mother, this recognition should have been liberating. But instead, it seemed to deepen her despair. Perhaps success made her realize that no amount of artistic achievement would ever earn her mother's genuine love. Perhaps she was exhausted from years of fighting depression. Perhaps the weight of being Peggy Guggenheim's daughter had simply become too much to carry. On March 1st, 1967, Peggy was found dead in her Paris apartment. She'd taken an overdose of barbiturates. She was 41 years old, and she left behind 4 sons and a body of work that would be largely forgotten in the decades to come. The aftermath and the inability to grieve. When Peggy received the telegram in Mexico informing her of Peggy's death, her reaction was complex and ultimately revealing. In her memoir, Confessions of an Art Addict, she wrote about her daughter with what seemed like genuine grief. She described Peggy as not only a daughter, but also a mother, friend, and sister to her. She called her death unexpected and mysterious. She wrote that no one in the world had she loved so much, that she felt like the light had left her life. But the reality was more complicated. Peggy refused to accept that Peggy had taken her own life. Despite Peggy's history of depression, despite the overdose, despite everything, Peggy insisted it must have been an accident, or, worse, that Ralph had somehow been involved. She accused Ralph Rumney of being responsible for her daughter's death. She pursued legal action against him, using her wealth and connections to make his life miserable. There were no grounds for prosecution. The evidence clearly indicated Peggy had taken her own life. But Peggy wouldn't let it go. She effectively accused Ralph of causing her daughter's death, and in the process, she took custody of Sandro away from him. Ralph Rumney's life was destroyed by Peggy's accusations. Friends described him alternating between penury and ridiculous abundance, sometimes living in squalid rooms, other times appearing at Venetian restaurants with Peggy's money. His relationship with his son was severed. His reputation was damaged. When he died in 2002, his obituary in The Guardian mentioned how he'd been unforgivably accused of his wife's death. Why couldn't Peggy accept the truth? Perhaps because accepting that Peggy took her own life would have meant acknowledging her own role in her daughter's suffering. It would have meant confronting decades of emotional neglect, criticism, and the inability to provide the love Peggy desperately needed. Peggy had spent her entire life seeking love from men who couldn't give it to her. She'd replicated her own mother's emotional coldness with her own children. She'd created an artistic legacy that would outlast her, but she'd failed at the most basic human connection: being a mother to her daughter. In the years after Peggy's death, Peggy continued living in Venice. She continued exhibiting her collection, supporting young Italian artists, and maintaining her position as one of the most important collectors of modern art. She wore her famous butterfly-shaped sunglasses designed by Edward Melcarth, rode in her private gondola with her dogs, and entertained visitors from around the world. She donated her palazzo to the Solomon R. Guggenheim Foundation in 1970, followed by her collection in 1976, with the stipulation that everything remain in Venice. She wanted her legacy preserved, wanted to ensure that her contribution to modern art would be remembered long after she was gone. But she never truly processed Pegin's death. She kept some of Pegin's paintings in the Palazzo collection, but she didn't promote her daughter's work the way she'd promoted Jackson Pollock or other artists. Pegin's artistic legacy was left to languish, known only to specialists and occasional museum visitors. Peggy Guggenheim died on December 23, 1979, near Venice, after suffering a stroke. She was 81 years old. Her ashes were buried in the garden of her palazzo, next to her beloved dogs. The Peggy Guggenheim collection opened to the public as a museum in 1980. The legacy and the costs. Today, the Peggy Guggenheim collection is one of the most important museums of 20th century art in Italy. The Palazzo on the Grand Canal attracts hundreds of thousands of visitors annually. They come to see masterpieces by Picasso, Pollock, Kandinsky, Ernst, and dozens of other artists whose work Peggy preserved and promoted. The museum acknowledges Peggy's complicated personality. Wall texts describe her as a bold, eccentric collector who fearlessly advanced modern art. They mention her affairs, her extravagant lifestyle, and her role in discovering abstract expressionism. They celebrate her as a woman who defied convention in an era when wealthy women were expected to be decorative rather than influential. What they don't emphasize is the human cost of Peggy's self-obsession. The daughter who grew up feeling unloved, who struggled with depression her entire life, who created beautiful art expressing the family happiness she never experienced, and who ultimately couldn't bear the pain anymore. That story is relegated to footnotes, mentioned briefly if at all. Pegin's work is displayed in the collection, usually a few paintings in a small room. The wall texts describe her naive style and surrealist influences. They mention she was Peggy's daughter, that she exhibited internationally, that she passed away in 1967. The sanitized language hides the tragedy. Visitors look at the cheerful paintings with their doll-like figures and move on, unaware of the suffering behind them. Peggy's grandson, Sandro Rumney Guggenheim, has spoken about his grandmother with remarkable honesty. He described how she withheld love even from him, her self-proclaimed favorite grandchild. He talked about watching her make his mother cry, about the emotional abuse that masqueraded as sophisticated detachment. His testimony provides a counter-narrative to the celebration of Peggy as a feminist icon and art world revolutionary. The truth is that Peggy Guggenheim was both things simultaneously. She genuinely advanced modern art, supported important artists at crucial moments in their careers, and created a collection that continues to educate and inspire. She also damaged nearly everyone who got close to her. She used people, lovers, friends, family, to fill her own emptiness, then discarded them when they failed to make her whole. Her marriages failed because she chose men who couldn't give her what she needed, then blamed them for not providing it. Her relationship with her daughter failed because she replicated the emotional coldness her own mother had shown her. Her friendships were transactional, based on what people could do for her art collection or her social status. And yet, she suffered. The evidence suggests Peggy experienced genuine pain throughout her life. She felt ugly, unwanted, and inadequate. She desperately wanted love but didn't know how to accept it or give it. She collected art compulsively, slept with hundreds of men, and created a public persona of shocking bohemian freedom, all in a futile attempt to escape herself. According to her own admission and biographer Anton Gill's confirmation, Peggy slept with approximately 1,000 men during her time in Europe. When conductor Thomas Shippers asked how many husbands she'd had, she replied with dark humor, asking if he meant her own or other people's. This compulsive sexuality wasn't liberation. It was a form of self-medication, a desperate attempt to feel something, to connect with someone, to prove she was desirable even if she couldn't be loved. The tragedy is that Peggy had everything: wealth, intelligence, access to the most creative minds of her generation, and the opportunity to make a real difference in the world. And she did make that difference in the art world. But she couldn't escape the emotional patterns established in her childhood. The cold mother, the absent father, the sense of never being enough. These shaped everything she did. When Peggy wrote in her memoir about her regrets as a mother, when she admitted her inadequacies and her inability to show affection, she was being genuinely self-aware. She knew she'd failed Peggy. She knew she'd caused pain. But knowing wasn't the same as changing. Even recognizing the patterns wasn't enough to break them. Peggy's story has been gradually rediscovered in recent years. Art historians and critics have begun examining her work more seriously, recognizing the talent that was overshadowed by her famous mother. Exhibitions have included more of her paintings, giving them the attention they deserve. But this resurrection of interest came decades too late for Peggy herself. The Peggy Guggenheim story is often told as a tale of triumph, a woman who overcame her conservative upbringing to become an important figure in modern art. And that's true. But it's also a story of generational trauma, of wealth that couldn't buy happiness, of fame that couldn't fill emptiness, and of a daughter who paid with her life for her mother's inability to escape herself. Peggy Guggenheim spent her entire life running from herself. She ran from her mother's world into bohemian Paris. She ran from failed marriages into countless affairs. She ran from emotional intimacy into art collecting. She ran from New York to Venice. But everywhere she went, she brought her demons with her. She created a remarkable legacy. The Peggy Guggenheim collection stands as a testament to her vision, her courage, and her willingness to champion art that others dismissed. She helped define modern art for generations. She gave Jackson Pollock his start. She preserved masterpieces during war. She created a museum that continues to inspire, but she also destroyed her daughter. She couldn't break the cycle of emotional coldness that had been passed to her. She recognized her failures, but couldn't change them. She wrote about her inadequacies as a mother, while continuing to treat her daughter with the same withholding cruelty she'd experienced from her own mother. In the end, Peggy Guggenheim's story isn't about art or collecting or even her scandalous personal life. It's about the limits of self-awareness. It's about how recognizing your patterns doesn't automatically free you from them. It's about how wealth and fame and cultural significance can coexist with profound personal failure. Peggy made an indelible mark on 20th century art. But the cost was measured in human suffering. Her own, her daughter's, and everyone who got too close to a woman who couldn't escape the emptiness inside her. She collected art obsessively, trying to fill a void that no masterpiece could touch. And when she died, surrounded by beauty in her Venetian palazzo, she left behind a legacy that was both magnificent and tragic. The heiress who couldn't escape herself. The collector who acquired everything except the ability to love. The mother who gave the world art but couldn't give her daughter what she truly needed. That's the real story of Peggy Guggenheim. If you enjoyed this video, please like,